A waiter's courage. How Elijah saved a life and changed his own. The Sterling Grand Hotel was an icon in the heart of the city. Towering above the neighboring skyscrapers, its sleek glass exterior gleamed in the afternoon sun, a beacon of wealth and status. Within its walls, marble floors reflected the light from chandeliers, and rich velvet drapes softened the edges of the grand spaces. Everything about it spoke of exclusivity and refinement. Guests who stayed there expected the best, flawless service, impeccable decorum, and an atmosphere that exuded luxury. It was a world where every detail mattered and where appearances were everything. For Elijah Brooks, that expectation was both a promise and a burden. At 33 years old, Elijah had worked at the Sterling Grand for nearly 6 years. He had started as a dishwasher in the basement kitchen, working grueling night shifts to make ends meet. Slowly, methodically, he had climbed the ranks. First to busboy, then to room service, and finally to his current position as a waiter in the prestigious five-star restaurant, Le Jardin. Every day, Elijah took pride in his work. His uniform was always crisp, his shoes polished until they gleamed. He remembered orders by heart, anticipated guests' needs before they spoke, and carried himself with quiet confidence. But beneath his polished exterior, Elijah often felt the strain of walking a tightrope. He was one of only a handful of black employees working the front of house in Le Jardin. And though no one ever said it outright, Elijah knew he was watched more closely, judged more harshly. Some guests seemed surprised to see him serving them in such an exclusive venue. Others were less subtle in their disdain. Still, he had learned to endure the microaggressions, the long stares, the deliberate mispronunciation of his name, the dismissive tones. He focused on the future. His wife, Mariah, was 7 months pregnant with their second child, and his 5-year-old son, Caleb, was about to start kindergarten. His job at the Sterling Grand provided their health insurance, their rent, and their stability. And so, Elijah swallowed his pride every day and did his job perfectly. The lunch shift that changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed. The restaurant was bustling with energy. A major financial conference in town meant high-profile guests filled the tables, bankers in tailored suits, entrepreneurs flush with venture capital, and the usual celebrities who favored the Sterling Grand's discretion. Elijah, the maitre d', Veronica Shaw, called as he adjusted his cuffs. "We're down 2 servers today. You'll need to cover sections 3 and 4. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied without hesitation, even though he knew how demanding those sections were. They included 3 window tables, often given to VIPs. As service began, Elijah worked with precision, balancing silver trays, wine bottles, and high expectations. His movements were fluid and controlled, his polite smile never slipping, even when guests tested his patience. A pair of executives complained about the temperature of their wine. A socialite insisted her salad be reconstructed twice because the dressing wasn't drizzled artistically enough. Elijah handled it all with practiced grace. But then came the Carmichaels, the family that would change his life. Jonathan Carmichael was the CEO of a multinational tech firm. His wife, Vanessa, was a well-known philanthropist. They were the kind of couple whose photos graced business magazines and gala invitations. With them was their infant daughter, Grace, and a young nanny who trailed behind, carrying diaper bags and toys. As Veronica seated them at table 12, prime real estate in the restaurant, Elijah made a mental note to provide extra attention. Families with babies could be unpredictable, and the Carmichaels were clearly important. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Carmichael," Elijah greeted them smoothly. "Welcome to Le Jardin. May I start you off with drinks?" Jonathan barely looked up from his phone. "Champagne. Your best. And something for the baby to keep her quiet." Elijah nodded, ignoring the dismissiveness. The nanny, a nervous young woman named Rosa, gave him a small apologetic smile as she settled Grace into a high chair. As the lunch service continued, Elijah kept a close eye on table 12. Grace was restless, fussing and banging her spoon on the table. Rosa distracted her with bits of bread while the Carmichaels discussed a pending merger worth billions. It was during one of Elijah's passes by the table that he noticed something. Grace had stopped moving. Her small face was red, her mouth open in a silent cry. Rosa was oblivious, distracted by a call from Mrs. Carmichael's personal assistant. Jonathan and Vanessa were still locked in conversation. Elijah's heart stopped. Grace was choking. The rescue. Without thinking, Elijah set his tray on a nearby table and sprinted toward Grace. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for security. He didn't follow protocol. He acted. "Elijah." Veronica's voice called after him, but he was already at the high chair. "She's choking," Elijah said, loud enough to cut through the clatter of silverware and conversation. Rosa gasped. Vanessa and Jonathan finally looked up, both going pale as they saw their daughter's face turning purple. Elijah carefully but swiftly lifted Grace from the chair. "I need room," he barked, and chairs scraped back as nearby diners made way. Supporting Grace's head and neck, Elijah turned her over his forearm and delivered 5 sharp back blows between her shoulder blades. Nothing. He turned her over and gave 5 quick chest thrusts with 2 fingers, keeping her head lower than her chest. The restaurant had gone silent. People watched in horror as the seconds stretched on. And then a soft cough. A small chunk of bread popped from Grace's mouth and fell onto Elijah's shoe. Grace inhaled sharply and let out a high, wailing cry. It was the sweetest sound Elijah had ever heard. He gently turned her upright, patting her back as her color returned. She clung to his shirt, sobbing. "She's okay," Elijah said quietly, holding her out to her mother. Vanessa snatched Grace into her arms, crying as she checked her daughter over. Jonathan stood frozen, his mouth working but no sound coming out. Then he stepped forward. "You saved her," he said. His voice cracked. Elijah nodded, his heart still racing. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Jonathan said. "No, you didn't. You did more." Applause broke out from surrounding tables. Some guests stood. Others wiped their eyes. But Elijah barely registered it. He was still watching Grace. When she reached a small hand toward him, he smiled. The consequences. Elijah returned to work. Or tried to. Veronica approached him almost immediately. "Elijah," she said tightly, "Mr. Hargrove wants to see you." Elijah nodded, already feeling dread. The meeting. Richard Hargrove was the restaurant manager. Older, white, and meticulous about rules. "Elijah," Hargrove said as Elijah entered his office. His expression was hard to read. "What you did out there was unacceptable." Elijah blinked. "Sir, you left your station. You handled a guest child without consent. You disrupted the dining experience for our other patrons." "She was choking," Elijah said quietly. "You should have followed protocol," Hargrove snapped. "Notify management. Call for medical assistance. Let trained staff handle it." "She would have died if I'd waited," Elijah replied. "That's not your decision to make," Hargrove said coldly. "And now, because of your actions, the Carmichaels' lunch was ruined. They may never return." Elijah stared at him. "I saved their daughter's life." "This isn't a charity hospital," Elijah, Hargrove said. "This is Le Jardin." The words stung. But the next ones hit harder. "You're dismissed," Hargrove said. "Effective immediately." Elijah's stomach dropped. "You're firing me?" "I am," Hargrove said. "For violating protocol and disrupting service." Elijah stood frozen. He thought of Mariah. "Caleb. Their baby on the way. Is this because I'm black?" Elijah asked softly. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Don't be ridiculous." But Elijah saw the truth. He had always seen it. The Carmichaels intervene. As Elijah gathered his things, Jonathan Carmichael appeared. "I just heard," Jonathan said, furious. "You're being fired?" Elijah nodded. "Apparently saving a life isn't part of my job." Jonathan shook his head. "Not anymore. Come with me." Jonathan stormed into the manager's office with Elijah in tow. Vanessa followed, holding Grace. "You're firing the man who saved my daughter's life?" Jonathan demanded. "It's protocol," Hargrove said. "Protocol?" Vanessa snapped. "Your protocol nearly killed our daughter." "We'll take our business elsewhere," Jonathan said. "And we'll make sure everyone knows why." The threat hung heavy in the air. Redemption. Hours later, Elijah received a call from Evelyn Stanton, owner of the Sterling Grand. "I've reviewed the situation," Evelyn said. "Mr. Hargrove has been suspended pending review. And I'd like to offer you your job back, promoted to head waiter." Elijah was silent. "We're also launching a diversity and sensitivity initiative," Evelyn continued. "And I want you to be part of it." Elijah thought of Mariah's words from the night before. "Sometimes, change only happens if we stay." He agreed. A new beginning. Weeks passed. Elijah worked with Evelyn to create better policies. Staff underwent training. Guests noticed the improved atmosphere. One afternoon, Jonathan and Vanessa returned with Grace. "Thank you again," Jonathan said. Grace clapped her hands. "Hi," she said to Elijah. He smiled. "Hey, little one." And for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt seen, respected, valued. Conclusion. Elijah's story became more than a viral moment. It became a testament to integrity, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right and for oneself. Even in the face of injustice, Elijah chose hope. And in doing so, he helped change not only his life but the culture of an entire institution. And somewhere in the Sterling Grand, a little girl named Grace Carmichael giggled as she waved at the man who had saved her life and made a difference far greater than he had ever imagined.